My name's Riley. I'm 30 years old, and about 6 weeks ago, I walked out of my family's house in the suburbs of Chicago for what I knew would be the last time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even argue when my mother pointed her finger at my face and shrieked, "You're ungrateful. Get out and never come back." I simply picked up my laptop bag, grabbed my car keys, and left without a single word. At that moment, she thought she had won. She thought I'd be back in 2 days, begging for forgiveness and carrying a checkbook to solve their latest crisis. But she was wrong. Dead wrong. Now I'm sitting in my new apartment watching my phone vibrate violently on the coffee table. It's been buzzing nonstop for the last hour. My father's name keeps flashing across the screen like a desperate distress signal. After weeks of silence, the invincible family fortress I was forced to fund is finally starting to crumble, and they just realized their personal ATM has officially closed for business. I haven't answered a single call yet, but I did see the text that started the landslide. "Why haven't you paid the mortgage?" I felt a dark, cold satisfaction as I typed back, "Oh, I thought I wasn't welcome." Before we dive into how I uncovered their 8-month-long deception and the absolute chaos that followed, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single detail of how this family drama exploded. Now let's get into the rest of the story. To understand the sheer coldness of that not welcome text, you have to understand the life I led back in that house. For the past 5 years, my routine was a grueling cycle of data points and exhaustion. As a senior medical data analyst at a major firm in downtown Chicago, my days started at 5 in the morning and rarely ended before 7 in the evening. I spent my life staring at complex spreadsheets and healthcare trends, ensuring hospitals ran efficiently, all while my own home life was a slow-motion train wreck. Every time I received a promotion or a bonus, I felt a fleeting sense of pride, only for it to be immediately swallowed by the predatory expectations of Brenda and Thomas Miller. My parents didn't see my career as a personal achievement. They saw it as an upgraded revenue stream for their household. The most bitter pill to swallow was my older brother Derek Miller. At 34, Derek was a master of professional delusion. He called himself a freelance crypto consultant or an independent venture strategist. But in reality, he was just a guy who spent 18 hours a day in a darkened bedroom playing high-stakes online poker with money he didn't have. Whenever he lost, which was often, my mother would corner me in the kitchen, her eyes brimming with calculated tears, whispering about how Derek was just on the verge of a breakthrough, and how a little support from his successful sister could change his life. It started with me covering his car insurance, then his phone bill, and eventually I was the one funding his investment capital, while he paraded around the neighborhood in designer sneakers that cost more than my weekly groceries. Brenda and Thomas were experts at the art of the American guilt trip. They reminded me constantly of how they had sacrificed during the 1990s to give me a stable childhood in Illinois, using my gratitude as a weapon to bypass any financial boundaries I tried to set. My father, Thomas Miller, would sit at the head of the table sighing deeply over the rising property taxes, while my mother would casually mention that the mortgage payment was a bit steep this month. They never asked me to help. They simply described a looming catastrophe until I felt I had no choice but to step in. Before I realized what was happening, I had taken over the full monthly mortgage payment of $4,200, along with the utilities and the grocery bills. I was paying to live in a house where I was treated like a temporary guest whose only purpose was to keep the lights on. Derek would smirk at me from the couch, his feet up on the coffee table I had paid for, mocking my corporate drone lifestyle, while he lived off my sweat and overtime. I was working 12-hour shifts so he could maintain the illusion of being a successful entrepreneur, and my parents were his most loyal enablers, constantly shielding him from the reality of his own failures at my expense. Everything reached a devastating peak during my parents' 35th wedding anniversary dinner. I had spent the entire morning finalizing a massive data audit at the office before driving an hour to the upscale restaurant they had chosen, a place where the wine list alone cost more than my monthly car payment. As I walked into the private dining room, I noticed an unfamiliar man in a sharp suit sitting next to Derek. Mom was beaming, her hand resting on a thick manila envelope that sat ominously between the crystal glasses. After a few superficial toasts to their long-lasting marriage, the atmosphere shifted instantly from celebratory to predatory. Dad cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze, as he explained that Derek had found a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to launch a digital asset exchange, but needed a significant injection of liquidity to secure a commercial lease. The man in the suit was a private lender, and they needed me to co-sign a loan for $75,000. I sat there staring at the stake I hadn't touched, feeling a cold wave of clarity wash over me. For years I had been their safety net, but this was an attempt to shackle my financial future to Derek's inevitable failure. When I calmly said no, the facade of the happy family shattered. Mom's face contorted into a mask of pure rage, her voice rising until heads turned at the neighboring tables. She accused me of being a cold-blooded bean counter who cared more about spreadsheets than her own brother's dreams. She reminded me of the private school tuition they had paid 20 years ago, claiming I owed them my life and my signature. I tried to explain that co-signing was a permanent liability, especially given Derek's history of squandering every cent I had already provided, but she wouldn't hear it. Derek chimed in, calling me a selfish elitist who thought she was better than the rest of them just because I had a title and an office. The argument followed us back to the house, where the walls seemed to vibrate with Brenda's screaming. She stood in the foyer, blocking the stairs, and delivered the ultimatum that changed everything. She told me that if I wasn't willing to be a team player and support the family's interests, I had no right to occupy a room in her home. She shrieked that I was ungrateful for the roof over my head, a roof, ironically, that I was currently paying for. Dad stood in the shadows of the hallway, refusing to intervene as Mom pointed to the front door and told me to get out and never come back. I didn't cry this time. I walked past her to my home office, ignoring her insults, and grabbed a single locked briefcase. Inside weren't clothes or jewelry, but the paper trail I had been quietly assembling for months, every bank transfer, every mortgage statement, and every utility bill I had paid since I moved back in. I walked out into the cool Illinois night, the sound of the door slamming behind me echoing like a gunshot. I didn't look back at the windows. I just got into my car and drove toward the city lights, leaving them with the empty house and the mountain of debt they had so arrogantly assumed I would carry forever. Finding a luxury apartment in the West Loop of Chicago within 48 hours was surprisingly easy when I wasn't bleeding $4,000 a month into a house that didn't belong to me. For the first time in my adult life, the silence of my surroundings wasn't heavy with expectation or the distant sound of Derek's video games. I spent my first 3 weeks decorating my new space with high-end furniture that actually reflected my taste, rather than the outdated floral patterns Brenda insisted on. I even treated myself to a brand new European SUV, a reward for the thousands of hours of overtime I had previously sacrificed to keep my parents afloat. Without the constant financial drainage of the Miller household, my bank account began to swell, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known since before I moved back home. I deliberately kept my phone on Do Not Disturb for everyone except my closest colleagues, relishing the anonymity of the city. Back in the suburbs, however, the illusion of prosperity was operating on borrowed time. My parents had spent years assuming that my contributions were an automated, endless resource that required no oversight. During the first month of my absence, Brenda and Thomas continued their lifestyle of leisure, as if nothing had changed, fueled by the arrogance that I would eventually crawl back and settle the bills. They went out to expensive Sunday brunches, and Derek even convinced them to buy him a new high-speed gaming setup under the assumption that the mortgage and utility payments were still being drawn from my accounts as usual. They didn't bother to check their banking portals because they had long ago offloaded that burden onto me. In their minds, I was just having a prolonged tantrum, and the house would continue to function through the sheer force of their entitlement. The atmosphere in that house shifted from smug confidence to cold dread toward the end of the second month. It started with a bright red notice from the electric company pinned to the front door, followed closely by a series of increasingly urgent letters from the mortgage servicer. My father, Thomas Miller, finally sat down at the kitchen table to review the stack of mail he had been ignoring, only to find that the automatic payments had stopped the very day I walked out. The panic began to set in when they realized they had spent every cent of their own modest retirement income on Derek's lifestyle and their own vanity projects, leaving absolutely nothing for the actual debts. Brenda's initial reaction wasn't one of remorse, but of profound indignation that I had dared to stop my service without a formal resignation. They looked at each other in the echoing hallway of a house they could no longer afford, realizing for the first time that the walls around them weren't built on their own hard work, but on the exploitation of a daughter they had just banished. As the grace periods expired and the late fees compounded into thousands of dollars, the comfortable life they had curated began to disintegrate, leaving them trapped in a reality they were completely unequipped to handle. The silence was finally shattered on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when my phone lit up with a message that was as arrogant as it was predictable. It was from Thomas, my father, and it contained no apology, no inquiry about my well-being, and certainly no remorse for the day they kicked me out. Instead, the text read with a cold, demanding tone, "Why haven't you paid the mortgage this month? The bank is sending notices and the online portal shows a massive deficit. Fix this immediately." I stared at the screen for a long time, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. They truly believed that after banishing me from their lives, I would continue to serve as their silent benefactor from afar. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I opened my banking app and began to dig through the digital paper trail I had meticulously maintained. What I discovered made my blood run cold with a new kind of fury. For the past year, I had been transferring $4,200 every month into a joint account designated specifically for the mortgage. However, as I cross-referenced my outgoing transfers with the house's actual equity statements, the numbers didn't add up. I decided to call the loan officer at the bank, a woman I had spoken to briefly during the initial purchase years ago. After verifying my identity, her voice took on a tone of professional pity that I will never forget. She informed me that the mortgage had not received a full payment in over 8 months. The small increments that had been paid were just enough to keep the foreclosure department from calling every day, but the principal remained untouched. While I was working 12-hour shifts to save the family home, Brenda and Thomas had been skimming nearly 70% of my money for something else entirely. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I checked Derek's social media, which I had blocked, but could still view through a secondary account. There it was, posted exactly 7 months ago, a photo of Derek leaning against a used bright red European sports car with a caption about reaping the rewards of hard work. The price tag for that specific model was exactly $32,000, almost the identical amount that had been siphoned from my mortgage transfers over that same period. They hadn't just used me to keep a roof over their heads, they had actively robbed me to fund Derek's midlife crisis and vanity. They had lied to my face every single morning at the breakfast table complaining about rising costs, while they handed my hard-earned salary to my brother so he could play the part of a successful man. My hands were shaking as I realized the depth of their betrayal. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a calculated financial assault. I went back to the text message from my father, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. The satisfaction I felt wasn't from the money I had saved, but from the realization that I finally held the power to let their house of cards collapse under the weight of their own greed. My phone didn't just buzz after my reply. It exploded with a frantic call from Brenda that I decided to answer just to witness the final gasps of their manipulation. The second I pressed the button, my mother's voice came through thin and trembling, immediately launching into a rehearsed monologue about her failing health and the chest pain she had supposedly been experiencing since I abandoned them. She sobbed about how the stress of the bank's foreclosure warnings was literally killing her and how Thomas was too distraught to even speak. It was the classic Miller family defense mechanism: when the money stops, the medical emergencies begin. She pleaded with me to be a good daughter just one last time, claiming that they only used a tiny portion of the funds for emergencies and that my lack of empathy was the real tragedy here. Derek's voice could be heard in the background, shouting about how I was ruining their lives over a few missed payments, still acting like the victim in a mess he had actively helped create. I waited until she ran out of breath before I spoke my voice, devoid of any warmth or hesitation. I told her to stop the performance because I was currently looking at the detailed audit of the joint account they thought I never monitored. I began to read the line items out loud, starting with the 16 separate transfers to a local luxury auto dealership that totaled $32,000 in less than a year. I cited the $400 dinners at steakhouses on nights when she had called me crying about not being able to afford her medication. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and deafening, a stark contrast to the histrionics of a few moments ago. I asked her point blank if the red sports car currently sitting in their driveway was the emergency she was referring to, or if Derek's new high-end poker software was considered a vital household utility. Thomas finally grabbed the phone, his voice no longer demanding but cracked with a desperate, hollow kind of shame as he tried to explain that they just wanted Derek to have a fair shot at success. The realization that their responsible daughter had spent months silently documenting their theft left them completely speechless. I informed them that I had already contacted the bank to officially remove my name as a guarantor for any future extensions, and that I had provided the fraud department with a record of where my mortgage contributions had actually gone. Brenda tried to start screaming again, calling me a traitor to my own blood, but the fire had gone out of her voice. She knew the leverage was gone. I told them that the ungrateful child they had kicked out was simply following their orders by staying away and keeping her resources to herself. They had gambled with their home to fund a fantasy for a son who wouldn't even work a part-time job, and now the bill was due. There was no more screaming, no more fake coughing, just the sound of two people realizing they had traded their only reliable support system for a pile of lies and a car they couldn't afford to put gas in. I hung up the phone before they could utter another word, leaving the echoes of their own greed to fill the empty rooms of the house I was no longer willing to save. The cold bureaucracy of the American banking system moves with a relentless speed once the safety nets are pulled away. 3 weeks after my final conversation with Thomas and Brenda, the inevitable arrived in the form of a legal process server standing on their manicured front lawn. Because I had officially withdrawn my financial guarantee and flagged the suspicious diversion of funds, the bank moved straight to a non-judicial foreclosure. There were no more extensions, no more grace periods, granted out of pity for a senior couple, and certainly no more of my money to grease the wheels of their denial. A bright orange notice was taped to the mahogany front door, the same door I had been told never to darken again, stating that the property was now under the control of the lender and that all occupants had 14 days to vacate the premises. The illusion of the Miller family's upper-middle-class stability in that quiet Illinois cul-de-sac vanished in a single afternoon, replaced by the harsh glare of public failure. For Derek, the collapse was even more violent and immediate. Without my monthly investment injections to cover his losses, his digital house of cards folded. The private lenders he had borrowed from those sharp-suited men who weren't interested in Brenda's fake chest pains began showing up at the house at all hours. They didn't want crypto strategies or excuses. They wanted the $32,000 he had squandered on a lifestyle he couldn't maintain. The red sports car, the symbol of his supposed success, was repossessed by a tow truck at 3 o'clock in the morning, while the neighbors watched from behind their curtains. Derek was no longer the golden child with unlimited potential. He was a 34-year-old man with a trashed credit score and a mounting pile of legal threats. His friends, the ones he had treated to expensive dinners with my salary, disappeared the moment they realized the well had run dry, leaving him to face the consequences of his arrogance alone in a room full of empty luxury shoeboxes. The final morning at the house was a masterclass in poetic justice. I didn't need to be there to know how it looked, though a sympathetic former neighbor sent me a photo that confirmed my suspicions. Brenda and Thomas were forced to load their remaining belongings into a rented yellow truck, their movements slow and heavy with the weight of their new reality. There was no dignified exit. They were tossing mismatched suitcases and old furniture into the back, while the local sheriff's deputy stood by to ensure the locks were changed on schedule. The neighbors' people they had spent decades trying to impress with stories of their successful children stood on their porches and whispered as the Miller legacy was packed into cardboard boxes. They had traded a daughter who would have protected them forever for a son who wouldn't even lift a finger to help them carry the heavy sofa to the curb. By sunset, the house was empty, the windows dark, and the family that had demanded I leave had finally been forced to follow their own advice, drifting toward a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, with nothing but the bitter taste of their own choices to sustain them. The morning after the foreclosure was finalized, I walked into a service provider store in downtown Chicago and changed my phone number, effectively severing the last digital tether to my past life. I didn't stop there. I systematically blocked every distant aunt and cousin who had suddenly emerged from the woodwork to preach about family unity and the sanctity of blood. These were the same people who had remained silent for years while I was being financially bled dry, yet they felt entitled to demand I forgive a debt that had nearly cost me my future. I realized then that true peace isn't just the absence of noise. It is the absence of people who think your only value is what you can provide for them. My new life in the city became a sanctuary of focused ambition and quiet evenings where every dollar earned was a dollar I decided how to spend. The reality for the rest of the Miller family was a stark, unvarnished descent into the consequences of their own making. Without my income to act as a buffer, the three of them were forced into a world they had spent decades looking down upon. Thomas Miller, at nearly 70, had to take a job as a night security guard at a local warehouse to cover the rent on their cramped apartment. Brenda, who once spent her afternoons at high-end boutiques, was now scanning coupons and working part-time behind a deli counter. But the most significant change was Derek. Forced by the sheer necessity of survival, the man who once claimed to be a venture strategist was now unloading delivery trucks at 4 in the morning. There were no more designer sneakers, no red sports cars, and no more delusions of grandeur. They were finally experiencing the hard work they had so casually exploited from me for years, and the bitterness of that transition reportedly poisoned every conversation they had. I often think back to that night in the foyer when my mother screamed that I was ungrateful. I used to feel a pang of guilt, but now I see it as the greatest gift she ever gave me. Her cruelty was the catalyst I needed to stop being a martyr and start being a person. I learned the hard way that family is a bond of mutual respect, not a lifetime contract for exploitation. If you find yourself in a situation where your love is being measured by your bank balance, or where your success is viewed as a community asset for the lazy, remember that you have the right to walk away. You are not a bank. You are not a safety net. And you are certainly not responsible for the poor choices of grown adults. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to let the people who don't value you finally face the silence they earned. I am no longer the human ATM for the Millers. I am Riley, and for the first time in 30 years, my life belongs entirely to me.